everyone, welcome to Two Car Pros. My name is Ryan and today we will be continuing our how to build an LS series. We are building an LM7 5.3 liter V8 from General Motors. Where I left you last is we were sending our engine to the machine shop. We finally got that back. The only piece of advice I have for you is get a quote in advance before the work is completed. That way you don't have a surprise at the end, a large bill you weren't expecting. It should cost right around $1,500 to get the thing machined the way you want, and the way we did it was 30 over. They cleaned up our crankshaft and they also hot tanked a bunch of our parts. So it should be right around 1,500 bucks, and that's going to be less or more depending where you are. We actually took it to a pretty high-end race shop, so ours was a little bit on the more side, but that's okay because the work was absolutely excellent. If you're anywhere near Placentia, California, check out Superior Automotive. They're the ones that did our machine work for us. And before we go any further, I want to mention that this build is sponsored by Summit Racing. They aren't sending me any money, but they are sending me an absolute ton of really cool parts. Please go check out summitracing.com and buy all your speed parts from them. They are excellent, their customer service is fantastic, and their parts are premium. Today we're going to be focusing on the 3 C's of engine building: cleanliness, crankshaft, camshaft. So what we're going to do is disassemble the engine, clean it to an inch of its life. You can't be too clean, I say that later on in the video as well. And then we're going to dry it off, hose it down with some WD-40, and then get to work putting the camshaft and crank in. So let's jump into it. So we're finally back here from our machine shop. This is the way you're going to receive it. We already put it on a stand, which I showed you how to do earlier in this build. Exact same process, except it's a little easier because it's quite a bit lighter. So we can go ahead and remove our plastic, and we're going to go ahead and inspect the machine work. And what I mean by that is look inside the bores and all the machine surfaces to make sure that there's no big gouges or anything like that. You want to make sure all the machine work is nice and smooth and you're not going to have any kind of problem when you're assembling it. The next thing we're going to worry about is cleanliness. So machine shops are pretty good about cleaning things, but it's your engine and you want to make sure that there's no microscopic metal filing somewhere in there that you can't see that might affect your engine in the future. It could end up actually destroying it. So cleanliness is job 1 here. So we're going to take some regular just Tide detergent, put it in a bucket, fill it with some water, and get to washing. But first we're going to remove our 5 main journal caps on the bottom of the engine. So now what we're going to do is remove all our main caps, and this is basically how you're going to get it back from the machine shop. And what they do is they put these main caps on and bolt them down, torque them to spec, and then send a line hone through to make sure everything is nice and circular and concentric. So what we can do is, the first thing we're going to do is remove the skirt bolts using an 11mm socket here. And mine happen to be 12 point because they are made by ARP and are considered high performance, so that's something to think about. Now we remove both skirt bolts from both sides. Now we can grab our breaker bar with a 16mm 12 point, and again, these are made by ARP, and they're 12 point, and traditionally they're 6 point, so something to think about. Alright, so when you're loosening these, you want to go outside and then inside. There we go, we can remove our ARP nuts here. So because we have studs instead of bolts like we did previously, you could kind of use those as leverage like we showed in episode 1 or 2 when we were taking it apart. They have studs, so it inhibits, lateral movement here. So what we're gonna do is take a slide hammer with some washers on the end of it and very carefully place it in the webbing of the main here. Give it a couple taps on one side, then the other, and it comes right off. So now that we've got the first main cap off, we can do that to the rest of the main caps, and now we're ready to clean it. And make sure you keep them in order. Ours are labeled. If yours aren't labeled, go ahead and label them. They have to go back in exactly the way you took them out. So now we're just gonna hose off a little bit, get nice and wet, and then we're gonna grab our terry towel loaded with some just regular Tide detergent. You could use any detergent you wanted to. You could even use something like Valvoline Ultra Clean, but I really like laundry detergent because I know there's no abrasive in it, and it's a nice gentle degreaser. So make sure you get nice into the bores, and you can't be too cleanly. Don't worry about going over cleanly. The only thing you want to avoid is letting it dry because you don't want it to flash rust. So go through all of the surfaces you can with your soap and water. So now that we've washed and rinsed our engine nice and clean, no soap suds remaining, we're gonna grab some compressed air. I really like this attachment because it has a nice rubber tip. Make sure you don't gouge any of the surfaces out with your air sprayer here. Then we're gonna blow dry it. So now that we're nice and clean, we're just gonna go ahead and give the entire engine a nice coat of WD-40. Get that everywhere you can, all the nooks and crannies, and what that's going to do is prevent the engine from flash rusting while we're assembling it. There we go, our block is nice and WD-40'd up. Now that we're clean and WD-40'd up, I like to go around at this point and make sure that your studs for the mains are nice and tight. Look around at all the threads for every single hole in your block to make sure that those are nice and cleaned and tapped correctly, especially on your oil pan or any kind of oil mating surface. And then you want to go around and make sure, especially on the front timing cover here, see we have a little bit of stuff we need to scrape off there, a little bit of gasket material. So you want to scrape that off while the engine's still apart, and you can catch it instead of it going down inside of it while you are assembling it. And then this part's pretty crucial too. You want to look inside of your cam bearings to make sure that, see that hole right there? That it actually goes into an oil gallery there, and this one does. If this is off at all, like if those two holes don't match up, then it needs to go back to the machine shop and they need to redo your cam bearings. And don't worry too much about this other hole that doesn't go to anything, because we have one that does go to an oil supply. This particular bearing manufacturer, this must go in a couple different engines, so that hole is probably for something else. So now comes here the really exciting part where we're putting new stuff on our remachined engine. And I have to point out that we are sponsored by Summit Racing, and they were super, super cool and sent us a bunch of parts I will be going over. But our first one is going to be our timing set. There's our part number there. I've left that down below in the description for you, and we can take that out and examine it, which is really cool because it's a budget-friendly option, but it's still made right here in the United States, which is awesome. There's our oil drive gear there. Set that aside, and then we have our timing set itself. Check that out. Oh, that's nice. And look at how many different positions you can put the timing at. And it has a nice bearing on the back. So this is a really nice high quality unit. I'm very excited to put this on our engine. And the reason I'm going over the timing set now is because this actually has to go on, and it's going to help us hold the camshaft into the engine, and I'll explain that as we go on. And again, sponsored by Summit Racing, we have our performance camshaft. Now what you're looking for in a camshaft is basically located on the Summit Racing site. Here's our card if you want to pause it and take a look at all the technical specs in detail, but that's a whole science all by itself on cam separation, lift and duration and all that. What I like to do is just go on Summit's site, type in what engine I have, look for the application, and this was a performance street application, which is what we're building. So that's good enough for me. And these are extremely high quality. They're billet and they're for the roller lifters, and I am very excited to put this on our engine. So before we put our camshaft in, what I like to do is grab some Permatex Ultra Slick. This is the stuff I love using. Lots of guys have been using this for years and years. It is good stuff, and I've left a link down below in the description just for you for it. And what I'm going to do is just put a decent amount on the end of my fingers and just apply it to the bearing surface here, just like that. And go ahead and do that for all of the cam bearings. Now we can move on to grabbing our Permatex Ultra Slick again, and we're going to go ahead and just sauce it up. Do not be afraid to get it nice and covered in this assembly lube. You can't use too much. So make sure it's all over the nice bearing wear surfaces, especially at this point because we're not putting lifters in just yet. I'm going to make sure that the journals here are nice and lubed up. Oh yeah, look at that. That looks excellent, and we are ready to put in the engine. And before we go do that, I want to mention that you can tell that this is the front of the cam because it has that locating pin. So that is going to go in the front of our timing set. So now what we can do is carefully insert our camshaft like this, and if it binds at all, try to reorientate yourself. It only really goes in one way once the surfaces are parallel like this. So we can feed that in, and then what I like to do is get two bearings in like this, and then switch hands. So now you're at this stage, what you're gonna do is use your other hand, your left hand, to guide it along. And you wanna be very gentle. You don't wanna gall any of those surfaces. And if it's not going, don't wrench it, don't force it. Be gentle. I'm being very gentle, like I'm handling a baby bird. And as we approach, what's cool about an LS is you can actually reach through the back of the engine. On my big block, you couldn't do that. Make sure everything's nice and parallel, and it'll just slip right in, just like that. The only thing you want to make sure, because the engine stands a little angled, it's angled this way, down that way, you don't want the camshaft to just kind of flop backward, because it can actually fall out the back, and you don't want that damaging any kind of bearing. So make sure it's going to sit in its home like this. So now that our camshaft is installed, we can talk about our thrust plate here. An LS uses a camshaft thrust plate. It also has an oil transfer passage through here, and it's kept in place via this gasket. Here's our stock one. As you can see, our gasket is totally missing. So that probably fell apart when I was taking it apart. I couldn't really find any kits that just have this gasket by itself, but our friends over at Summit were more than happy to send me this really cool piece. There's our part number. The link is down below in the description. And what's really cool about this is when I took the stock one off, I went back and reviewed the footage, and it actually uses standard regular hex 10mm bolts that are a normal bolt height. This is cool because it actually comes with flush countersunk bolts. Check that out. So maybe that gives a little more thrust clearance for the camshaft gear. And then we have some ARP bolts also sent over by Summit Racing. Thanks a bunch, guys. There's our part number. Link is down below in the description. These will hold our camshaft timing sprocket on. So we can go ahead and place our thrust plate on the front of our engine here, install one of our bolts, and this is a T40 Torx head. And lightly put that in like that, and we'll grab the other ones. There we go. Install it just like that. Now what we can do is grab our torque wrench, set it to 18 foot-pounds, and tighten these up. And we're gonna go as evenly as possible. So notice I didn't get a click out of my torque wrench yet. So I'm just gonna go as even as I can, just kind of feeling it out, snugging those up. Now I'm getting a click. There we go. There we go. Our camshaft thrust plate is totally installed. Now we can install our camshaft timing gear here. I'm going to put my left hand on the back of the camshaft because now it can slide backwards and out of place, but it can't actually slide any forward because of this thrust plate. So I'm going to hold that with my left hand while I put this sprocket on with my right, just like that, and that'll stay in place for now, but keep an eye on it. Grab one of our 10mm ARP bolts we got out of that kit and install it like this. Now, what we're going to do here is we are going to just leave these finger tight because we're not installing the timing set just yet. We are just putting this gear on here to prevent the camshaft from falling out of the back of the engine. This is just for assembly purposes. We're not torquing these down just yet. We don't have that chain on, so we're gonna leave that just like that for now. So what you can do too at this point is grab the front cam sprocket that we installed and turn your camshaft over. That looks amazing. And if this camshaft doesn't turn real nice like this, like if it's really hard, builds up and then lets go, or it like cogwheels it all, or just plain hard to turn, you should be able to turn this very, very easily. That means either your camshaft is wrong or your cam bearings are wrong and you need to remeasure everything and recheck. But ours is absolutely perfect. And I know some of you might be asking why we put the cam in first. I like putting the cam in first because you can support it as you're putting it in. Some people like putting the cam crank in first and then the camshaft second. I find that a little more tricky personally, so this is the way I like to do it. The next thing we're gonna worry about is putting in our crankshaft bearings on the block side. So what we're gonna do is, we've already cleaned this very, very thoroughly when we were washing everything, and we also hit it again with some carburetor spray and some paper towels. What I want you to do is take your thumb, I like using fresh gloves so that way you can see very vividly, is you wanna take your thumb and just do this inside of that channel there, and make sure that there's not any particulates, and then wipe. And then off camera over here, I'm wiping it on a nice fresh white terry towel. So then I can do it again for 2 there. Nothing, very nice. 3, pretty clean. 4, we're just making sure we're getting all that little dust and little particulates out of there, stuff you can't even see. And 5. And my glove came back clean every time. You can even do it again. You can do it 2 swipes or 2 passes if you want. You can't be clean enough. So now we can move on to our crankshaft bearings, sponsored by Summit Racing. Once again, they are super cool and sent this to us. Now I want to talk about that this is a standard size for our crankshaft. We didn't have our crankshaft machined. Sometimes you machine it 10 under because you have to, but ours was in good enough shape that it just could be resurfaced and you just use the stock bearing size. And that's what these are. So these go on 1, 2, 4, and 5, and this is for number 3. You can tell because it has the thrust surface. Be careful when you're opening these up. You don't want to scratch any of the bearing surface there. Just be very careful and use nice clean hands, and they come clean from the factory, so you won't have to clean them again. So we can go ahead and start installing these. So we can grab our block side piece of the bearing. You can tell it's the block side because it has these nice holes in there, and the tang is on the correct orientation to line up. Make sure this is nice and clean, but they come pretty clean from the factory. And then we can just drop this in, just like that. So I have a pretty tight shot here of the bearing in the block, and what I want to point out is that this surface here of the bearing is directly even with this surface here of the block on both sides. If it isn't, kind of massage and push it down, or just take it out and put it back in again until both of these surfaces on both sides are perfectly even. So now I showed you how to do 1, do that exact same thing for numbers 1, 2, 4, and 5. Just like that. Now we're ready for number 3. So I noticed on number 3 here, which is what we're focusing on, that our bearing doesn't actually have a tang on it like our other bearings do, and it has that kick out here for a stock application. But don't worry too much about that. If this bearing is exactly the same front to back, it doesn't matter which way it goes on, as long as you put the bearing with the holes on the block side. Newer engines don't even have those tangs, so that's something to consider as well. I also want to go over that number 3 is special because it's a thrust main bearing. This actually controls forward and aft movement of your crankshaft and makes sure it doesn't walk too far forward or too far rearward in the engine. So it helps center it in the center of the block. There we go, it's always a gratifying sound. So here is our crankshaft. This is actually our stock crankshaft, and what I've done is cleaned it up using some carburetor spray and some compressed air, making sure that our bearing surfaces are very, very clean. What I also want to do is talk about what type of crankshaft you're going to use. This is our stock crankshaft that came out of the truck with 260,000 miles on it. I don't know if this is the original crank or engine for that truck, but I'm willing to guess it because of the condition the engine was in when we took it apart. And we took this to our machine shop, and they said that the bearing surface was in very, very good shape, and all it needed was to be resurfaced very, very lightly, which means we can use stock sized main bearings. So what that also means is if you have a crankshaft that can't be resurfaced on this surfaces here, you're going to have to get those remachined, and unfortunately that means you're also going to have it reheat treated, which is an additional $300 or so, and the machine work plus that heat treating puts you right into just buying a new crankshaft territory. So that's something to think about when you're dealing with these older crankshafts. So these right here are your oil journals that go inside of your crankshaft, and you want to get some compressed air and blow through these as well to make sure they're nice and clean. Now we can install. So the next thing we're going to do is lube up our bearing surfaces. Now we're going to go ahead and grab our Permatex Ultra Slick yet again, our best friend here. We're going to apply a little bit of
our assembly loop here, and we're going to put it on the bearing, but you want to stop about 1/4 inch short of the top of the bearing. And the reason you're going to do that is that way it doesn't get to the top of the bearing and seep in between the bearing and block surface, because if that happens, you have a chance of spinning the bearing, which will ruin the engine. And do that for all 5 of your journal bearings. So I stopped on number 3 here to point out that you're going to treat this one the same as the others, except for the thrust surfaces on the front here and the rear. And again, you're going to stop before you get to the top there, and make sure you do on the front thrust surface and the rear. Just like that. And there we go. So now we're ready to carefully drop our crankshaft in, and you need to drop it in completely parallel to the engine. You can't put one side in and then the other. It needs to go in perfectly even. Just like that. So at this stage, do not turn your crankshaft. You're gonna be really tempted to do it. I'm tempted to do it right now, but don't do it, because what can happen is that lube can get spun up on top of the bearing, which is what we're trying to avoid, which can make the bearing spin when you eventually start it, destroying your engine. Before we go any further, I wanna mention that we mic'd out our crankshaft journal here. And we had about 1/1000th clearance, which is just perfect. Most of the time you can pretty much trust your machine shop on that one. If you don't have a mic or you're not sure how to use it or whatever, you can also use a plastic gauge, which is like basically Play-Doh that you put here between the bearing surface and the journal, and then you bolt it down, torque it to spec, take it back off, and measure the squish. You cut it in half, a little section, and then measure the squish on that. We don't really do plastic gauge here. We haven't done it in 20 years since I've been alive building engines, and it's always been fine. Basically, either the crankshaft's gonna turn, it's not gonna turn, or it's gonna be loose. In those 2 last situations, it's gonna have to go to the machine shop anyway. There's nothing you can do. So now we can talk about our main caps here. There's 5 of them, just like we removed earlier. And I also wanna go over, we are using an ARP stud kit, sponsored by Summit Racing. They sent this out to us. There is our part number, link down below in the description to this exact kit we're using. Always use ARP. They are my absolute favorite fastener company. So they have supplied our skirt bolts that are 12-point and studs instead of bolts, because our studs aren't torqued to yield like the bolts are. So you can keep using them over and over and over. And what's really cool about ARP is they figured out to use the same nut size for both inner and outer fasteners, unlike GM that used a bigger size for the inner and a smaller size for the outer. So what we're going to do to clean our main caps, because cleanliness is the most important part of engine building, is grab some carburetor spray, give that a nice hose down, and then grab some compressed air, and blow that dry. So now this is really very clean. What you can do is to double check that is grab a nice clean thumb and wipe just like that. You can even do another finger if you like, another pass, and we are ready to install our bearings. So I'm gonna show you how to put the bearings in, number 1, and this applies to all of the main caps here. So what's interesting about these is it actually has tang positions on both sides, so it's a little bit confusing. But if you remember, it's gonna sit in the engine like this, because this is the way we have our engine orientated. So our engine tang is over here on this side. Now when I took it apart, the tangs opposed each other. So that means that this bearing goes in just like this. So we can flip that back over, line that up. Go ahead and put our tang side in first, and push in our bearing the rest of the way. Now, there we go. Now, just like on our engine, we want to make sure that these bearing surfaces between the bearing and the cap are exactly flat on both sides like this one is. So we're ready for installation. So now we can grab some of our super lube here and apply it on our bearing surface. And again, you only want to go up to about 1/4 inch or so, because you don't want to spin a bearing. Just like that, and now we're ready to put this in. So now we're ready to put our first main cap in, making sure it's nice and parallel upon its installation. Just like that. And I also wanted to mention that we double checked and made sure these studs are nice and snug, but they were snug from the machine shop. So on the end of my finger here I have some ARP assembly lube. You should put that right on the bottom, a little bit on the bottom of the nut here. And we're just going to put these on finger tight for right this moment. So the reason we're putting fastener lube on is that way we get an accurate torque figure. So now we're going to take our 16mm 12 point and a very small ratchet, and we're just going to evenly tighten down our inners here. And we're just going to go as evenly as possible, and I have this really small ratchet so I can't go too crazy on it. What this is going to do is sink our main cap here down onto our crankshaft. But we're not going to torque it to spec yet. We're just snugging things up a little bit. There we go. Spin these outer ones on. Just like that. Give those a little love, just a little bit. And now we can install the rest of our caps. So now that all our main caps are in, these two on the left and the right, they're on they're tight. They're like wrist tight with that little ratchet I showed earlier, but number 3 here are just finger tight. I can actually wiggle the nuts with my fingers here. Now what we need to do is take a plastic hammer and hit the left side of the crankshaft and the right side of the crankshaft 1 time each to set our thrust bearing. And there we go. Now we can tighten these up using our little ratchet. Of course, we're going to tighten our inners and then our outers. Now we can put our skirt bolts in. So what we're going to do next is take some of our old friend silicone rubber and apply some to our fingertip here for our skirt bolts. And what we're going to do is apply it just underneath the head of the bolt there. Just like that, and it's going to prevent oil from leaking out. We can install that bad boy in. And then grab our little ratchet and just go a little wrist tight on that. And then just do that for all 10 of them. All right, so now comes the exciting part where we're going to torque everything down. Before I go any further, I want to mention I printed out our instructions from ARP, and you can see that it has a tightening sequence as well as torque recommendations. Now, it just says go straight to 60, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go 30 first for our first pass and then 60 for our second. So I'm going to break it down where our first pass for the inner studs is going to be 30, and then first pass for outer studs is going to be 25, and then I'm going to step it up to the 60 and 50 figure. So on the skirt bolts, we're just going to do right to 20 because the difference between 10 and 20 isn't that big a deal. But for the inner and outer studs, we're going to go ahead and go in sequence and 2 steps. So 30, then 60, and then 25, and then 50. So let's get to work. And I wanted to also mention that if you had a stock configuration with bolts, you're going to need to go to 15 pounds, I believe, and then you have to go 85 degrees or something like that. I'll leave a link down below in the description for the stock way to do it. But if you're going this far, you're building an engine, I recommend just spending the money getting the ARP stuff. They're stronger, they're better, they're reusable, and it's what race motors have, so something to think about. Definitely worth the money. Also, if you're using the stock way with the bolts, you can't reuse your old bolts, throw those away, they are torqued to yield. So again, another reason to use a nice ARP stud kit like this one. So we're here at 30 foot-pounds, and we're just going to follow along here. This is our first guy. And then number 3 is this one. Number 4. And then number 5. And number 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now we're moving to our outers. So we're going to change our torque wrench down to 20 5. So do 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. All right, so now we've stepped our torque wrench up to 60 foot-pounds, and we can go ahead and tighten them the rest of the way in our sequence. Goes 9. There's 10. So now we've done our 60, we can knock our torque wrench back down to 50 to do our outers. We're starting on number 11 there. It's this one. And 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and a very good arm workout. So now we can move on to our skirt bolts, grabbing our 10mm 12 point and setting our torque wrench down to 20 foot-pounds. We can start here on number 21, and then go across to number 22. Go across again for 23. Cross again for 24. So you're always crossing the engine, which ensures even tightness. This is 25. Yes. Got 25 here. 26. 27's way over here. 28's across from that. 29 is over here on the front. Our final one, number 30, is right here. And we're done. So this is the really exciting part. This basically dictates whether or not you're gonna be able to use this engine or if you have to send it back for remachining. Basically, you want it to turn with very little effort. If it doesn't turn or it's very difficult to turn, send it back. Something's not concentric, something's wrong. Do not proceed forward. Or if you can grab it and jiggle it, you know, it goes tick, 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 then something is too big and something's wrong. But for us, oh yeah, look how easy that turns. I can do it with one hand, just like this. If yours doesn't turn like this, send it back. So our final step for today, and anytime you're building an engine, it does not matter if it is not together and complete, go ahead and get a trash bag, or I have this nice engine bag the machine shop gave me, and protect your investment with some nice plastic.
So that is how to clean your engine when it gets back from the machine shop, dry it off, hose it down with WD-40, put the cam and crank in. This video was a little bit on the long side, but I wanted to make sure I got everything into one big video instead of trying to break it up. So future episodes probably won't be as long as this one, but I'm glad we got everything done today that we needed to do. Huge thank you to Summit Racing for sponsoring this build. It has been an absolute blast to work with them, and their parts have been nothing short of impressive. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future build videos coming very soon. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.